Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your kind words. The shir should be a schus for all the cholim and all those who need Yeshuas. Just to mention very, very quickly, I wrote a sefer on the Yud Gimel Ikrim, and the name of the sefer is Evan Shasia, and hence the name of my website. Anyway, so that's the explanation for the name. All right, now Evan.
What does Evan Shasia mean?
Evan Shasia is now okay. Evan Shasia is the foundation stone that the world was created from. Evan Shemimeno Hu Shasa Olam, and that is in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. As a matter of fact, in Bayis Sheni, where there was no Oron, because it was Nignaz, at the end of, before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Bayis Rishon, they hid it, the Oron. In Bayis Sheni, they didn't have an Oron, so the avoda of, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim was done, they sprinkled in front of the Evan Shasia. As is in the Gemara, and so it's the foundation stone that the whole world was created from, and the Yud Gimel Ikrim are the foundation stone of Judaism. Okay.
That's fine. Good. Okay, that's fine. It just bothered me. I need to know what it meant. Okay, thank you.
Fine. Okay.
Now we can go on with the real share.
Okay. So the topic tonight, what can we learn from a talking donkey? This is a very peculiar miracle that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made, that the donkey should speak back to Bilam. Undoubtedly, Chazal tell us that he was caused great embarrassment by it. He certainly did not enjoy the experience. But we have to understand what we have to learn from it, because it wasn't his final punishment. He was later, killed. As a matter of fact, Chazal tells us Pinchas himself killed him. So we have to understand it was, what was the revelation? What are we supposed to learn from the fact that the donkey spoke up against him and spoke up for, as it were, a donkey was speaking up for his own honor. Now, everyone knows the famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the Asar Dvarim Nivru Erev Shabbos Bein Hashmashos. There were 10 things created Erev Shabbos Bein Hashmashos, and we will give a brief overview on all of them. But one of those 10 was the Pia Asom. This mouth that HaKadosh Baruch Hu miraculously gave the donkey was already created, before the first Shabbos ever came in. It was pre-created, and what we're supposed to learn from that it was, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was preparing the mouth of the donkey, ever since the days of creation, and not just wasn't on the sixth day during the day when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created all the animals, like as we know earlier, prior on the sixth day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu first created all the animals, the land-dwelling animals, and then he created man. But the Pia Asom was not created together with the creation of the other donkeys. That was special at the end of the sixth day, Bein Hashmashos. And we have to understand what Chazal are telling us with that. Now, it's interesting to note that we are in the parshas that deal with these mouths. Right? 2 weeks ago, Parshas Korach was the Pia Aretz, right? The mouth of the earth. And last week, Parshas Chukas was the Pia Be'er, the mouth of the miraculous well that followed Am Yisrael everywhere. Chazal say also that bear spoke and said Shira. And this week is Pia Ason. It's very interesting that right now we are in the Parshas, one after another, of these three mouths. And they were all created Erev Shabbos Bein Hashmashos, and we will endeavor to see what we can learn from them in general, why they're called mouths, and why they were created Erev Shabbos Bein Hashmashos. But of course, in particular, the nace that's particular to this week's parsha, the Pia Ason, the mouth of the donkey. Now, before we go into this, later on in the same parak in Pirkei Avos, we have a rather cryptic Mishnah. Now, it's not cryptic in as far as understanding what the words are saying. It's just the overall message is beyond understanding, and that's the Mishnah towards the end of the parak. If you have three traits, you are a Talmud, a disciple of Avram Avinu. If you have three other traits, you are a disciple of Bilam. Talmid of Shamar Avinu, so the Talmid of Avram have been ayin tova. They're generous, ruach nemucha, and they're humble, v'nefesh shvala, and they're not greedy. They're not into any of their desires. Talmid of Shabila Marasha, the Talmid of Marasha, they're the opposite. Ayin Ra, they look by Ayin Ra and everyone else. Ruach Gavoa, and they're haughty. V'nefesh Rechava, and they're full of taiva. So far, so good. But then the Mishnah says something which, the words are easy to understand, but the concept is mind-blowing. Ma ben Talmido Sharvino, Talmido Shabilam Rasha. What is the difference between the Talmidim of Avram Avinu and the Talmidim of Bilam Rasha? Talmido Shavram Avinu, Ochlim Ba'ozev, Nochlim Amabah. The Talmidim of Avram Avinu, they eat in this world. They have a good life here. V'nochlim Amabah, and they inherit the world to come. Sheva Lancho Avayev, V'otzosam Al-Maleh. I will give those who love me yesh, referring to a Mishnah in Uktzin, that Koshua is destined to give the tzaddikim 310 olamos in Olam Haba, and I will fill up their treasures. That's also in Olam Hazeh. I will tamid of Shabilam Marasha, but tamid of Yorshim Gehenna, they inherit Gehenna. Yordal Bershach, they go down to total obliteration. Shnev Avato Kim Tarn Bershachas, Anchidamir Lech Simeh Vani Eftach Bach. Now this is impossible to understand. What is the Mishnah talking about? You just told me that Bilam is, he doesn't forgive others, and he is haughty, and he's full of taiva. The opposite of all of Avravinu's good traits. And then you ask, what is the difference between the Talmid of Avram Avinu and the Talmid of Bilam Rasha? It's obvious. These are tzaddikim, these are Rishayim. It's like the Mishnah is asking like an obvious question. What's the difference? You just told me the difference. And then the Mishnah spells out the outcome that any Cheder Yingel could calculate himself. The tzaddikim get Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. The Rishayim get neither and go to Gehenna. So what was the Mishnah asking like the simplest of questions? After lining up Avram Avinu and his Talmidim as being Balei Midas Talvis. Okay? Everyone with me? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Yeah, okay, just making sure. They are Balei Midas Talvis and the Talmidei Bilam Balei Midas Ros. It's obvious that these are the ones who are going to go to Gan Eden, and these are the ones who are going to go to Gehenna. What is the Mishnah talking about? Okay, so before we go on to get back to the Asar Dvarim Shenivu Erev Shabbos Bein Hashmashos, I'd like to make an observation. Anyone who would read the Parsha, just Chumash, right, without Rashi, and you just go through the Parsha with a standard Hebrew English dictionary, right? Not with Rashi, Rashi doesn't just translate the words. Rashi brings to the table, he brings to the page the Torah Shabbat Peh. He brings Chazal to the page. Right? Imagine going through the Parsha with a literal translation of the Psukim. What does Bilam look like? He looks like a very, very honorable person. I mean, if you take the words at face value, whatever God puts in my mouth, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to say that. I'm not going to say anything else. If Rashi, in the name of Chazal, right, point out subtle inferences like Imi, Tenli, Balak, Malo, Beso, Kesavazog, if Balak will give me, even if he'll give me, I can't go against Hashem. No, so Rashi points out, well, whoever mentioned money, why do you mention it? No one didn't mention money. But if not for that subtle inference that I can't speak for my audience that I'm talking to right now, I would have never caught that myself. All right, if I would have just looked at the text and translated literally, Bilam seems like a very honorable, upright, God-fearing citizen. Only wants to do what's right. I would have not caught these subtle inferences, and obviously those subtle inferences are MS if Chazal say it and see it. But there's got to be something to learn, from the fact that the text, only al pi the Torah Sheba'al Peh do we know, what Bilam was really thinking and what a rotten person he really was. There's a message there. The fact that it took the Torah Sheba'al Peh to reveal these subtleties to us, that there's something going on over there. All right, so I want to go back to that Mishnah that we opened up with. The Asar Drag Shnivu Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashis. And of course, we're going to mainly dwell on the three mouths, and of the three mouths, the Piarts and the Pia Bear and the Pia Ason, of which we're going to dwell on that mainly, and we're going to dwell mainly on the Pia Ason, as what happened this week's Parsha. But I want to quickly read through all 10, and we'll see a very interesting common denominator. Without going into too much detail, let me just read through them quickly. So, Pia Oretz, Pia Be'er, Pia Ason, at the mouth of the earth, that's Saul called, the mouth of the Be'er of last week's Parsha, and the Pia Ason of this week's Parsha. HaKeshet, right, the rainbow. Hamon, right, the Mon, which Bnei Yisrael ate in the desert. Vahamate, right, and the staff. So I see some Mefarshim attributed to the Mata of Aaron, which also is in Parshas Korach. Vashamir, right, and the Shamir, which they used to cut the stones for Beis Hamikdash. Haktav v'Dichtav, writing, language and writing. Va'luchos, and the luchos. V'yeshem afa mazikim. Some say also the mazikim, those are the shadim and those that cause damage. Ukvuraso shel Avram, some add, Ukvuraso shel Moshe, rather, some add the burial place of Moshe. Ve'elo shel Avram, and the ram that Avram Vinu sacrificed instead of Yitzchak. V'yeshrim asfata. Some say also the tongues, right? You need a pair of tongs to make a pair of tongs. When you melt the metal in the fire, so where the first pair of tongs come from. All right, so there's first thing to observe from the list is that the overwhelming majority, more than 50% of these 10 things that we just read happen all in the same era. Which era is that? Dora Midbar. So Pia Bear, Pia Ason, the Mon, the Mate, Aktav, Michtav, and the Luchos, right? Kvuraso Shel Moshe, right? Much more. The vast majority, happened during the Dor HaMidbar, and that's something which deserves observation. That it will perhaps get us to what these 10 things are about. And once we get to the crux, we'll know how to fit in the few odd men out, the Keshet, in the days of Noach, right, and the Isle of Avram, and the Mazikim and the pair of tongues. So, dating is like this. We refer to Am Yisrael, all over, whether it's in Tanakh, whether it's in Tefillah, whether it's in Medrash. We refer to Am Yisrael as Goy Echad Ba'aretz. Right, like Shabbos Mincha time, Umi Kam Choyso Goy Echad Ba'aretz. Or the famous Chazal, by the Karbonos of Shmini Atzeres, Par Echad, Ayil Echad. It's all one korban as opposed to the massive amount of Karbonos that were during the days of Sukkot, that were 70 bulls, Kneshivim Parim, Kneshivumos. But on Shmini Atzeres, it's only Par Echad, Ayil Echad, Keneged Uma Yechida, for the single nation. And the list, goes on and on, whether Chazal, Psukim, the idea that there's one nation, Am Yisrael. How is that true? Why? How is that true? There were 70 nations, at least, by inception, right? And then, of course, they've subdivided into many nations as per, look at a world map, right? What do we mean? Am Yisrael is the one nation. Umma Yechida. What does that mean? How will you understand that? Right? So the pshat is like this. How many, obviously we're not talking about how the United Nations divides up the world. We're talking about the map of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's map. Right? How many nations were there supposed to be by the original design? By Bria Sa'olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Adam. Right? And of course it was understood, he told them, Pruvu, they should be fruitful and multiply. But even though you wanted there to be many people. millions and millions of people. But how many nations did he want? He wanted to be millions of people. How many nations? Answer. Only one nation. By the original design, there was only supposed to be one Am. Because he wanted, by original design, he wanted everyone to be Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kodesh, like Am Yisrael, a nation of priests and a holy nation. So, in the sad reality that we live in, and as we're going to explain, that sad reality began with Chet Adam Rishon, as we're going to explain. But the sad reality is that there's only one Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kodesh. There's only one nation that has HaKadosh Baruch Hu as their king and as their leader and is dedicated to serving him, and that's Am Yisrael. But did HaKadosh Baruch Hu want any other type of nation? Of course not. Now, he served man, he created man to serve him, for man's own pleasure, as we know. As the Ramchal tells us at the beginning of many of his Svarim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to be mativ, bestow goodness, but of course to bestow goodness that's earned. So it shouldn't be Nahama de Kisufa, shouldn't be bread of shame, that man should have a real acquisition of goodness, and you'll get it by serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what he wanted for mankind. So he didn't want there to be such a thing as a different type of man that doesn't serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And just like man is supposed to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, man is supposed to use all the resources that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, in order to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the secret, that man, who is the most choshev thing in creation, was created last. Right? You would think it should be the other way around. If man is the most important thing that God created, it should have been created first. So why was he created last? He was created last because the Adam his mission is to use all the resources that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, use them to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you can't create Adam first because he would be walking the earth unable to do his mission. His mission is to take everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created and use it to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the one nation on earth would also bring unity to the whole world, a cosmic unity, because this one nation would use all the resources that they could possibly tap into to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now here's an amazing thing, right, that Chazal tell us that in the Sefer Torah of Rebbe Meir had his own Sefer Torah, obviously not for laning purposes, for reasons that will become obvious in a second. He had a Sefer Torah where he had different words and different oisias that in our Sifrei Torah obviously was meant for his own personal record, because it would not be kosher for laning, because it has there were deviations from the text as we have it, and Chazal noted it must have been for Meir's private use. So it says, Dayas Hashem Okim Kosnos or, right? He made in our Sefer Torah says Kosnos or, vestments of leather, or with an ayin, right? In the Sefer Torah, Shareim Matzu Kosuv Kosnos or with an aleph, vestments of light, vestments of light. Right. So what was Rabbi Meir alluding to? Right. So the Mefarshim explained he was alluding to the big change that there was as a result of Chet Adam Rishon. Now, as the Ramchal writes in the Das Tfunis, right, Adam Rishon's body before the sin was on the level of what our neshama is right now. Adam Rishon's guf was on the level of our neshama as we know it today. And the simple proof of that, it may sound like an amazing chiddush, but when you think about it, that has to be the case. Because where did Adam Rishon live? He lived in Gan Eden. Now, in our day and age, only spiritual entities, like a neshama outside of a guf, can go to Gan Eden. And Adam Rishon was there with his body. So that means that Adam Rishon's body was on the level of our soul. And if that was the level of his body, you can only imagine, or rather you could hardly imagine, what was the level of his soul. Right? So that means Adam Rishon, he was kosnos or, he was vestments of light. Even his guf was like or, was like light, was as refined as light as opposed to or with an ayin, as opposed to skin. He was light as opposed to skin. Right? And that was before the sin. Right, so, and after the sin, we went down from Kosnos Or with an Aleph, that our body was like vestments of light on top of the neshama, to now being vestments of Or with an Ayin, vestments of skin. So points out Rav Isaac Chaver an amazing thing. What's the difference in gematria between Aleph and Ayin? Right, we went from Or with an Aleph, which Or Aleph is gematria 1. Right, to ayin, to Or with an ayin, which is gematria 70. We went down from being when mankind were beings of light. There was only going to be one nation on earth. Everyone would have been what we call today Jewish. Now they wouldn't be called Jewish; they would be called mankind. But all of mankind, when they were on beings of light, right, were going to be like just one nation. What we call Jewish today, right? But then when we went from Or with an Aleph, light, to Or with an Ayin, to skin, we went from 1 to 70. And that's why there are 70 primary nations. Right, that when man went from light to skin, right, and he broke off from his Devekas to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, going from light to skin, it's going from 1 to 70. And that's why there are Shivim Umos. But all those Shivim Umos, which are the primary nations, all the nations of the world are offshoots of today, that all those nations came into being because of Chet Adam Rishon. Now that man did. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't do it, that was mankind's sin. So that means HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself only really created one nation. Mankind created 70 nations that, then branched out, from 70 to how many the United Nations were killed today. And that was all because of the sin that as we know, lowered our madrega and increased the power of the Yetzer Hara, who's become, the Yetzer Hara has become the competing master of the universe, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And just like we said before, man was meant to use all of creation to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right, so of course the defilement of man, that there is such a thing as nations that don't serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rachmana litzlan. That's not the Jewish nation. We're a Mamlechas Kohanim B'Goy Kosh Ashelam Shashem Elokav. Right, we're the nation that Hashem is our God, is our King. Right, but there are other nations that don't identify that way. Basically, every other nation other than Am Yisrael. Right, but that also defiled the Bria. That defiled the whole cosmos, because Am Yisrael is meant to use everything in the cosmos to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now you have these competing nations that don't have that on their agenda. Serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not on their agenda. And they also use the resources of the world for their purposes. They use the resources of the world, right, for negative purposes. So their existence is not just a Yerida, a descent in level for mankind. It's a Yerida for the whole cosmos. And that's why it's not a coincidence. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Adam immediately after the sin, Arura ha'adama ba'avurecha, earth is cursed because of you. Everything went down in Madrega. Right? And that's why the earth now doesn't, life is not as easy as it used to be. And this whole thing, it wasn't just the earth. It was also on all those that dwell in earth. Everything got defiled. Everything went down in Madrega. And the continued use, of the resources on earth, not for Avodas Hashem, just further and further defiles, creation. As opposed to how the Adam was meant to fix creation by harnessing everything to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everyone with me? It's hard to tell when you don't see the crowd. Anyway.
We're here.
Okay. Anyway. Yes. Okay. So now in the process that actually starts from Noah, but in a very non-obvious way, as we're going to explain, right? But a process that actually starts with Noah, but more obviously gets started with Avraham Avinu, and comes to fruition in the Dor HaMidbar, is to get a nation back that's according to plan. Basically, to cause the emergence of Am Yisrael. What's a little bit obvious is that Avraham Avinu built the potential for Am Yisrael. He built the potential, and he got promises from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He got haftachas, He got all types of promises. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, tells Moshe Rabbeinu, I only made promises to them, I haven't delivered yet. That's why I need to take Am Yisrael out of Mitzrayim. Right? And so now all those promises made to Avraham Avinu, because of how exceptional Avraham Avinu was, right, come to fruition with the door of Moshe Rabbeinu. We're actually taken out of Mitzrayim, and we get the Torah. Right? And then it's called that we've raised a nation that's finally a nation according to plan. So the roots of all the other nations of the world, were Chet Adam Rishon. The roots of Am Yisrael's physical existence, are Avraham Avinu, but there's a step before that I'm going to get to. That's the root. It comes to fruition with Moshe Rabbeinu and the giving of Torah. But of course, there is the in concept when HaKadosh Baruch Hu said Naaseh Adam, he meant an Adam like Am Yisrael. Everyone knows the famous pasuk in Yecheskel and the drush of Chazal on that pasuk. Rekach etzon mariti Adam atem. I took my herd that I shepherd. You are Adam. Say Chazal, famous Chazal. Atem kuriyim Adam, ve'eina atem kuriyim Adam. You're called Adam. Right? The Goyim are not called Adam. And there are quite a few halachas that we learn out from that. And that we're called Adam, they're not called, meaning when HaKadosh said Naaseh Adam, he had Am Yisrael in mind. People like Am Yisrael in mind. He didn't have the Goyim in mind. That's what it means, Atem kuriyim Adam. So even if we're like the youngest of nations, relative to the original 70, because they emerged already fully by the Dor HaFlaga. Right? But, of course, in concept, we were first with a concept that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had in mind. So, I want to go back to the Keshet, right, the rainbow. That's one of the 10 things that are mentioned here. And then I'm going to go back to all 10, and then we'll start going full circle. Right, the rainbow. Now, the rainbow is probably the greatest cause for anti-Semitism. Now, why do I say that? First of all, I say this, Mipi Mori Varabi Moshe Shapiro, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a covenant with the world. He's not going to destroy the world again. Now, everyone could think, all earth dwellers could think, that, they have a deal with God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he promised not to destroy them again. So that means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu must be happy with them as they are. Now that's what's very deceptive, because the Keshet, right, the rainbow, was for Noach. That's when all of humanity were still B'nai Noach. Right? It was before the emergence of Avraham Avinu, right, which starts the roots and the process of creating an Am Yisrael. Right? So that's what's very deceiving about the rainbow. That people might think that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu made this bris with the entirety of mankind with no kesher to the Jewish people. That's what you might think, and that's the big mistake. And that's the mistake that the Goyim make, that they think that they're okay just the way they are, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu made this covenant with them, when there was no such thing as B'nai Yisrael. Avraham Avinu was not yet born. But there's an interesting Gemara in Chulin, Daf Kuf Lamed Tes. A fascinating Gemara. A lot of people know segments of this Gemara because this Gemara is always invoked Purim time. The Gemara says, Moshe min HaTorah minayim. Where can we see a remez to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah even before he was born? So the Gemara brings the following pasuk at the end of Parshas Bereishis, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is already decreeing the Mabul. Lo yadun ruchi b'adam la'olam. I'm not going to contend with man forever. B'shagam hu basar, for he is flesh. He's going to live 120 years. Says the Gemara, that's a remez to Moshe Rabbeinu. B'shagam, shagam is gematria Moshe. Right? For he is flesh, that's gematria Moshe. And that's what the pasuk ends at. He's going to live 100. There'll be 120 years. The pasuk shot is that there's 120 years left till the flood comes. But we know Moshe Rabbeinu lived to 120. So that pasuk which was the gzeira of the Mabul, is a remez to Moshe Rabbeinu. Right, and then after that, the reason why I say everyone mentions this Gemara Purim times, because immediately after that, the Gemara launches into Hama Minatar Minayin, Esther Minatar Minayin. Oh, after that, it goes straight into finding allusions to all the characters of the Purim story. You know, Hamina Eitz and Vanochi Hasta Esther Panai, etc., which we're not going to deal with that. Why Moshe Rabbeinu is connected to the stories of Purim. That's another share. You'll have to invite me back Purim time. Right, but for the meantime, right, an amazing thing that Moshe Rabbeinu is alluded to by the Dor Hamabul. An amazing thing. That means that Kosh Baruch Hu got frustrated with the world because the world is not really to be Makabel Torah. Right? And of course, he destroyed it with water. Everyone knows that the Torah is nimshal l'mayim. The Torah is compared to water. Right? And this it says in the Zohar, right? There was a Kosh who lost, as it were, for lack of a better word, lost his patience, and he saw that the world in that form could never receive Torah. So it's as if the Torah itself destroyed them, and that's what it means they were flooded. They were flooded because Torah is all compared to water. You don't have Kalim to be Makabel Torah. But it was all about Torah, because the world is not ready for Torah. Right? And the world, it had to be like reformed and refashioned, reconstructed, to have any hope of being Makabel Torah. But it was all about Torah. It wasn't that, HaKadosh didn't like the type of people that there were, before Noach, but he likes Noach, right? And he likes the B'nai Noach. Nah, it was about Torah. The world was destroyed because it wasn't really for Torah. And that's why there's a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu, that HaKadosh wanted there to be like a Moshe Rabbeinu figure, finally, to bring down the Torah. And the world can never take that, since he was Gezer the Mabul. And it was all about Torah. It means that the world was reconstructed for the sake of Torah, because that's why it was destroyed. Because the world wasn't really for Torah. And making the new world was all about for the sake of the Torah. That means that Noach is not a goal onto his own. Right? The goal is to get to begin a process where humanity could refine itself until it could be Makabel Torah. And that means that the Keshet, right? The rainbow, it's not for the B'nai Noach. It's because the B'nai Noach were at that time carrying within them the potential for B'nai Yisrael. That means the rainbow is really for us. Because the whole reason why the world was destroyed was all about Torah. And that means that the world was rebuilt and there's a covenant with the world because the new world could, be refined and develop itself and expand and be roy for Torah. And that's what the Keshet is doing there. Right? And that's what Elosh Avram Avinu is doing there. And Elosh Avram Avinu, right, is in that Mishnah, right, is that, we know that Avram Avinu finally earned his place, earned his place, I guess you could say, concretized his place, as, the man who is roy to be the father of the Jewish people, and not just the father, biologically, right, but to be, as it were, the pillar that Am Yisrael stands on, with Hakedas Yitzchak. Ata Yadati Kiro Kim Ata. Right now, as Rashi says, if the Goyim ever complain, why did Jews get preferential treatment? No, I say, look what Avraham Avinu was willing to do. Right, the justification of the privileged position that the Jewish people have was with the Akedah. Now we know that that was finalized with sacrificing that ayil, right? That ayil that Avinu sacrificed instead of Yitzchak. He did it with all the kavanas as if he was sacrificing Yitzchak, Chazal say. That he wasn't like, I'm relieved that I don't have to sacrifice my son. No, that wasn't any of that. He was actually disappointed that he was deprived of the mitzvah. So, he didn't want to just get schar for being willing. He wanted it to be as if he actually did it. So that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him that ayil to actually perform and to do it in ma'aseh, not just in intention, but to have a real type of expression in physical reality that doesn't just be just good intent and good heart. And Chazal tells us that ayil had a din of Efer Yitzchak. It had a din as if it was the ashes of Yitzchak, that Efer Yitzchak, the ashes of Yitzchak are forever in front of the divine throne. And we know from that we got the shofar of Elo Shel Avram, and that shofar, Rashi says, V'kol ha-shofar, holach, holech, v'chazek ma'od. Rashi says right there, it's Kol Shofar Shel Yitzchak. Right, it's the shofar from that ayah. That concretized his position as being worthy of creating a chosen people that are going to get the Torah by Har Sinai. And the shofar by Har Sinai was the shofar of that ayah. So that means that these odd men out, like the Keshet and the Ayah Shel Avram, are stepping stones for the mainstay of everything that's in that Mishnah. The mainstay of everything that's in that Mishnah is what happened during the Dor HaMidbar. Because that's the door that got the Torah, and that's what brought to full fruition a nation that's according to the plan that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had in mind. So now, if you, I don't want to take up too much time because I do want to focus on the Pia Ason, which is our main sugya. All right, but if you, if you want to just get a little bit of an appreciation, right, of what the parallels are, because of the sin of Adam, you're going to eat by the sweat of your brow. All right, that was a result of the sin. What's the total opposite of that? The total opposite of that, mun. Because first of all, it's holy bread. It's not the earthly bread. But mun comes effortlessly. Ain't no sweat in collecting mun. Right? It fell right at your doorstep. Right? And for the people who weren't so righteous, their whole bezeh sapecho was they had to go a little bit. They had to walk a few steps to collect their portion. That was the type of work you had to do. That was there was no concept of bezeh sapecha tochalech. In the month, right? We find that the earth was cursed, the trees were cursed. Everything, nothing was the same. You have the the polar opposite with the mate Aharon, right? The staff of Aaron. That this thing even was detached from the ground. It blossomed and bloomed and stayed, it perpetually fresh until they were goyness it at the end of Bayis Rishon. And you could just go on and on. That so let's say one of the things that stands out. So of course the luchos, bringing the Torah to earth, because mankind, because the sin wasn't roy for Torah, and so even the shamir, right? So the one thing that another man out is that the shamir, to cut the stones for the Beis Hamikdash. Well, of course, in the midbar you didn't need the shamir because they didn't make the mishkan out of stone. But you understand that because in the Dor HaMidbar they became worthy of a Mishkan, of the Shekhinah dwelling amongst us on earth, because we became that nation, that Hashem Elokav, Hashem is the king and the God of this nation. That's what made it, the world worthy of a divine presence on earth, because there's a nation on earth. That's why we get the Shamir. That's why we get the Shamir. So now here's the beauty of it. All this. Right, all this Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashos. What does that tell you? What is it about all these things, which I'm explaining? These 10 things are all about, the saving humanity from saving a segment of humanity, which is Am Yisrael, from the head of Adam Rishon, and rebuilding, a nation according to the original plan. The one nation that there should be, the one nation that serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All this is Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashos. Right? What's the significance of Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashos? Well, two things. Right? First of all, plain and pashut. When did Adam Rishon sin? What day was it? Chazal tell us that unfortunately he sinned within 2 hours of being created. Right? The 1 hour after he created, he got the tzivui. And by the next hour, he had sinned, right? And the day wasn't over yet. It was still Friday afternoon, right? And then he was judged. The next hour and the hour after that was the 12th hour, which led into Shkia, right? That's Yotzah B'Dimus. He left. He emerged from HaKadosh Baruch Hu with grace, and that set the precedent for Rosh Hashanah, as you know. Chazal tell us. that every year we're judged on the same day that Adam Rishon was judged on, and we are Yotzei B'dimus. We go out with divine grace. So the sin of Adam happened Friday afternoon. Right? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after the sin happened, right? Like we said, he judged, and his judgment ended at Shkia. Right? His judgment ended in the 12th hour. Right? I said, okay, then this is where it's going to be, as because of what the sins that you did, right? And so judgment is given, and and the Chet Adam Rishon, all the consequences have been decreed. So and that happens at sunset. Right? So what happens right after Ben Hashmashis is in that twilight zone, literally twilight zone, between sunset and Tzeisa Kochavim, that we in Halacha are machmir, to give it the chumras of both. Like we don't do Malacha Motzei Shabbos until Tzeisa Kochavim, and we also desist from Malacha, on Erev Shabbos at Shkia, because we don't know exactly what part of that twilight zone is today and what part of that twilight zone is tomorrow. Right? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu does know, like Rashi tells us in Chumash. So during that time when it's still not Shabbos yet, it's after the sin and it's after the judgment, but it's still the days of creation, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still creating new things. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu quickly creates these 10 things. These 10 things that are going to save us from Chet Adam Rishon. Right? So A is Erev Shabbos Perishos, because they're coming, and this Year Barbanel says in his Pirush Hanavis, because they're coming as a tikkun and a way to extricate, mankind, that mankind that's going to be called Klal Yisrael, right, from the quagmire, right, that they got into as a Rosh Chet Adam Rishon. So he creates this, he creates these remedies, right, after mankind fell, right. But there's another deeper nakuda here, and this the Maharal points out. We know that the 6 days of the week are Keneged Olam Hazeh. How long is Olam Hazeh going to last? Gemara tells us, Shita Feshnin Have'alma. The world's going to last 6,000 years. The world's going to last 6,000 years. And then in the Chad Choruv, and then in the 7th millennium, the world is going to lay desolate. Like Shabbos, Shabbos, the world's going to cease, like Shabbos. Sof Elef Shana, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chazer Mechadesh Olam. At the end of the 7th millennium, HaKadosh Baruch Hu renews the world, and that's Olam Haba. All right, that's it's 1,000 years per day. So the work week is a mashal for the 6,000 years of Olam Hazeh, and Shabbos Me'in Olam Haba, because that's really where Olam Haba starts from. It starts from putting a cessation, putting a cap, stopping, breaking out of the cycle of Chol, putting Olam Hazeh to rest and ceasing it and getting out of the box. That's what ushers in Olam Haba. Right, so Shabbos is connected to Olam Haba, and the 7th millennium that is ushers in, enables the coming of Olam Haba. The 6 days a week are connected Olam Hazeh. Right, Kol Yisrael Yesh Lem Chelek Olam Haba. Right, all Klal Yisrael Chelek Olam Haba. If you have the very basic virtue of being Jewish, which by the way, according to the Rambam, means believing in the Yukim of Ukraine. But Am Yisrael is the nation that's destined to make it to Olam Haba, right? And in Olam Haba, it'll be literal, not poetic. In Olam Haba, literally, there'll only be one nation there. There's only going to be one nation, Am Yisrael. And, all the other nations in the world are not going to be in Olam Haba. Right? In Olam Haba, it's going to be literal, that Am Yisrael is going to be Goy Echad Ba'aretz. And that which, that we have a concept, I'm sure people in the crowd are immediately speaking up, and I can't hear them. What about Chasidei Umas Ha'olam? What about the righteous of the nations of the world? Says the Ramchal in the Derech Hashem. They don't have a separate national identity. The Chasidei Umas Ha'olam, the righteous Gentiles, like those that risk their lives to save Jews in the Holocaust, who truly deserve Olam Haba for them. they don't have a separate nationality. They're goyim, but they're like citizens of the Jewish people. The way the Ramchal says in Derech Hashem, they're like appendages. So Am Yisrael is the one nation that makes it to Olam Haba. Shabbos is the day that's connected, parallel Olam Haba. These 10 things have to create the link between, the 6 days of Chol, which are connected Olam Hazeh, and Shabbos, which is Kodesh, and is connected Olam Haba. These 10 things are all instrumental in making that transition, or these 10 things energize and empower Am Yisrael to be the nation that will live through that transition, make that transition, and live through that transition, and be the only ones that survive that transition. Like Bilam says to Amalek in this week's parsha, Reishis Goyim Amalek, V'achriso Adei he's the first of nations, for reasons that I'll explain another time, right? But Achariso Adei in the end, he will be obliterated. They don't have a future. Only Am Yisrael has a future, right? Like the Maharal says, it's implied by our words Yisrael. Our name ends off with Shem Hashem, implying that Am Yisrael's end is to be with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Olam Haba. Right? We're the nation that makes the transition, or you call it survives the transition. Right? And these 10 elements that HaKadosh created, Erev Shabbos, it's like he put them there between the weekdays and Shabbos. Those things are also created the energies that make the bridge to make a nation that will make it from Olam Hazeh to Olam Haba. Okay? So now, what didn't we explain? We didn't explain Pia Oretz and Pia Be'er and Pia Asam. These are the things we haven't explained yet. That why is it? After the things that we had in the last 2 parshas and this week's parsha. They're called mouths, and they were all created Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashas. So first, I'll tell you something very, very nice in the name of the Abarbanel, and then we'll go one step further. Right? That there were three people, for lack of a better word, for reasons one reason why I said it will become obvious in a second. There are just 3 characters, I should say. 3 main characters in the sin of Adam Rishon. Adam, Chava, and the Nachash. Right? So now, says the Abarbanel, so the Dor HaMidbar, like we explained, are all coming to undo the chet of Adam Rishon, partially, at least to the point that we enable an Am Yisrael to emerge. Right? And by the way, temporarily, if Shavas B'Tammuz is upon us, of course, we should help Mashiach should come first, right? But Shavas B'Tammuz, the Ched Egel, right? But if not for the Ched Egel, the Gemara says Yisrael Shamdu Har Sinai Pascha Zulmasim. We actually successfully, temporarily, got totally beyond the sin of Adam. In the time between Matan Torah, and the Ched Egel. With the Ched Egel, sadly, we reversed it. But even though we reversed a lot of the progress that we made, but still we remained Am Yisrael, this nation that's destined to get back to what Adam Rishon was before the sin, and to climb even higher. Okay, so now, Keneged Adam, Chava, and the Nachash, says the Abarbanel, is the Pia Oretz, the Pia Be'er, and the Pia Asam, Hauso. Right, that Adam, went down to and I should explain also that the 3 characters that are connected, obviously the Asam, the donkey is connected to Nachash, animal for animal, and we'll go deeper in that in a second. Right, the Be'er was in the schus of who? Schus of Miriam. Right, as it says in last week's parsha, Am Yisrael got thirsty after Miriam died, because so Rashi brings the chazal because the bear was b'schus Miriam, and they needed new schuyot to bring the bear back. Miriam is Keneged Chava. Moshe is Keneged Adam. So here's a beautiful thing that the Abarbanel says. I'm adding a few words of my own, but this idea is in the Sefer Nachlas Avos of the Abarbanel. Adam went down to earth, right? He was supposed to be heavenly, but he went after his typhus, and he became earthly. right? And that's why Hashem says, "Ki offer ata." You start off with being created from offer, vel offer toshu. You've gone back down to the dirt. Right? That's when a person dies. He goes down into the ground. Right? Now Moshe Rabbeinu is the opposite of that. Moshe Rabbeinu is a man that went to heaven. Moshe was able to go to Shemayim with his body. With his body, he went to Shemayim. He did it, more than once. And so Moshe Rabbeinu is the opposite of that. Now Korach, who starts up with Moshe Rabbeinu, he's anti-Moshe Rabbeinu, so he's the opposite of what Moshe Rabbeinu is the opposite of the failure of Adam. Adam went down to earth. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Shemayim. He's able to go to Shemayim with his body. Korach, who is anti-Moshe Rabbeinu, he gets swallowed up in the earth. Right? And now the Be'er is B'schus Miriam, and the Be'er was a big chesed, and Miriam was Mitakein, the Chet of Chava. And in that, she was a tikkun for Chava. That's why we got the miraculous waters. Right? She was a tikkun for Chava. The Pia Ason, says the Abarbanel, that's a countermeasure for the Nachash. The Nachash spoke, the Nachash had the gift of speech. It's a frightening thing, that we overlook. The Nachash not only had legs, as we know, before he got them clipped off, he had the power of speech. And he used that power of speech to speak against the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Right, and to Khan, Adam and Chava spoke Lashon Hara against the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Kodesh was afraid. If you eat from this tree, you'll be able to compete with him. So the dibur of the donkey is a tikkun for that. That the donkey is now granted power of speech, but to give Bilam Musar, and to put Bilam in his place. Because Bilam is coming to now uproot Am Yisrael. And Am Yisrael is like the nation that's repairing the chet of Adam Rishon, that the Nachash conned Adam Rishon into. And so the donkey, representing all animals, on behalf of all animals, is making a tikkun for what the Nachash did. The Nachash, with the power of speech, conned Adam and Chava into the chet. And now, Bilam wants to uproot the progress of trying to undo the chet, because he wants to uproot Am Yisrael. That's coming to be the type of humanity that's going to rise above chet Adam Rishon. So the donkey speaks and puts Bilam into his place. But it's time to take it another level. Right? And these ideas are in the Maharal and other Svarim. Right? That what's still missing. Because even if Am Yisrael is destined, right, to rise above Chet Adam Rishon, which is that will be finalized with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, and then from Mashiach Tzidkenu we work on even attaining higher levels that Adam Rishon was meant to attain, and he never attained. Not only so we make back what he lost with the coming of Mashiach, and yet we have more to go and climb yet higher and attain those madrigas he was meant to attain and didn't attain. Right? But when that happens, it shouldn't look like that the world wasn't meant to be that way. But the Jews conquered the world. The Jews conquered the world and imposed a new world order. Basically what Hitler and Marshall was saying about the Jews. They're trying to world conspiracy. They're trying to impose their world order on us, punishing us with a conscience. Right? We need a admission. We need an admission. We need an admission that life was always meant to be this way. It's not enough that from the point when Am Yisrael will rise to their glory, and Am Yisrael will become great again. That it's not enough that from that point onwards things will be good and things will be according to divine plan. That's not enough. We need an admission that it was always meant to be that way. We need an admission, right? And that's what you do with your mouth. You admit, right? And and that's the whole avoda. The main avoda that there is. For all the 6,000 years that things are going to be tough because of Chet Adam Rishon. So through all those generations, saying L'dor v'dor nodeh l'cha. Now nodeh means thank, but also means to admit. We have to admit that the world order of Torah, the world order of Avar Shem, the world order that Am Yisrael represents, we have to admit, or we admit, and we have to have the whole world admit that that's the way it was meant to be. It was always meant to be that way. It's not enough that when we finally reconquer the world, it will be that way from that time moving forward. We also need that to see it retroactively. There has to be an admission. An admission. Right? So now let's go back to the Pia Aretz very quickly, because I want to spend more time on the Pia Ason, because it's this week's Parsha, but also there's a particular message for us today. Right, the Pia Aretz. Moshe Rabbeinu is being challenged by Korach. Korach says, I think you made up the whole Torah. This whole world order, these mitzvahs you're giving us, I think you made the whole thing up. Right? So what does Moshe Rabbeinu says? Bezos teidun, ki Hashem shlochani, ki lo milibi. With this you will know, right? That Hashem sent me and I didn't make up. Meaning with the ground swelling up Korach, it was an admission that Moshe emes v'Torah so emes. So that's why it's called not just it's not called an earthquake. It's not just called an earthquake. It's called a mouth. As the Oretz is articulating that Moshe Rabbeinu is true. It's an admission to the truth of Moshe Rabbeinu, but it's also the earth's admission that the earthly way of life is meant to be the Torah way of life, and not the earthly way of life the way the Goyim see it. Right? As a matter of fact, that's what it says in the beginning of this week's parasha. Balak says, "Hina kisas eina Oretz." This nation has covered the eye of the earth. What does that word mean, eye of the earth? What does that mean? Just now, what's the Pashup Pshat? Covered the eye of the earth. It means, right? It means that it covered the earthly perspective. Am Yisrael brings a different perspective to the world, right? And we need a admission that the Am Yisrael's take on reality is the real one. The earth has to admit, and that's Pia Aretz. The Be'er, as Rashi tells us, the bear itself, through that they saw the body parts of nations that HaKadosh Baruch Hu destroyed, for the sake of Am Yisrael, to protect Am Yisrael. Right, the bear also, it makes an admission, right, to Hashgacha Pratis, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is protecting Am Yisrael. That everything that happens in the world, right, Am Yisrael is always protected. It's all for Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael is protected. So now the Pia Asom, the Asom. The name of the species is chamor. Now, why aton? And it was female. I don't want to get into that right now. That's something to do with Bilam's perversions, right? The aton, right? The aton. The name of the species is chamor. So the Maharal writes in a few places. Chamor is miloshen chomer, physicality, right? Just physicality. The lust for anything physical. It could be money, it could be food, it could be anything, right? Just the physical drives, which include all our passions, right? There has to be an admission. There has to be an admission, right, that, from physicality itself and physical drives themselves, that we were created for the purpose of the Torah, for the purpose of serving the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Like Chazal say, B'chol levavcha, b'shnei yitzrecha, the Yetzer Hara, and all our physical drives, we're also meant to be harnessed to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we need that admission. And that's what the Pia Asom represents, because that's what's needed before the end of time, is an admission that, physicality, not the pshat, it could also be harnessed to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No, not also harnessed. Created solely and only for the purpose of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We need that admission. And that's the secret, that Mashiach comes riding a donkey. Mashiach comes riding a donkey. Vu ani rochev al chamor. So it says, the Svar Makdoshim. The idea that Mashiach rides a donkey is that the chamor represents all physicality, chomer. Right? Mashiach rides it, says, this was all meant to be controlled by me. Right? It should all be part of Malchus Melcha Mashiach, which is the Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now, of course, when Mashiach rides the donkey, you don't need the donkey to talk. When Avram Avinu rides the donkey, which is very interesting, the Maharal points out, Avram Avinu rode a donkey to the Akedah also. Just like Bilam rode a donkey to curse Am Yisrael. Difference is, Avram Avinu at one point says, Shvulachem poi machamor, vani vanar nechalko. He leaves the donkey behind. It says the Maharal, he transcended the physical, and he was pure intellect and pure ruchnius, at that final leg of being willing to sacrifice Yitzhak. So you don't need a donkey to talk when Avinu displays how the donkey doesn't control him in any way. He's beyond the donkey. You don't need the donkey to talk, right? When Mashiach is riding and controlling the donkey. And by the way, that's the secret. The Leshem says, Rav Yosher's grandfather, the last of the great Lithuanian Kabbalists, that the secret, that there's going to be an explosion of technology and technological advancement before the coming of Mashiach. So he says that's all besod chamoro Mashiach. That just the opposite. We have to show, the world has to see how powerful physicality is. That, in physical it includes electricity, it includes nuclear energy, it includes everything that's called physicality. Energy is a part of it. We have to show the full glory of what the physical is capable of, and on top of all of that, Mashiach is going to ride. To show it's all for Malchus Shamayim. You have to show that it's all for Malchus Shamayim. You have to show how glorious it is, and yet with all the glory and all the power it has, it's still all for Malchus Shamayim. So the Indian of the whole technological explosion that there is prior to the coming of Mashiach, that's all beside the donkey that Mashiach rides on top of. All the power of physicality that's being harnessed for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the donkey doesn't have to talk if Mashiach is riding it. Right? And the donkey doesn't have to talk if Avraham Avinu shows how he's beyond it. Right? But if Bilam is riding the donkey, that's when the donkey has to talk. And the donkey has to speak up. And has to say that I'm not for you. Right? If I wasn't created to serve you, low life that you are, I'm for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm for Am Yisrael. Why you want to uproot Am Yisrael? The Am Yisrael that does 3 regalim. So now I want to get back to, with all this, that's all about the admission, right? And we'll talk about what this has to do with today, that we need a admission so badly, an admission from the world. Right? As I say, Bilam puts on a good show. Bilam puts on a good show, as if he's a God-fearing guy. He thinks he could fool HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He tells HaKadosh Baruch Hu straight. I'm only going to do what you want. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what you want. He tells the Balak, if you don't want me to go, I won't go. Bilam plays a game. Right? Plays a game, presenting himself as a righteous citizen, right? But on the inside, he's rotten. But on the outside, he plays it like he's a lover of humanity and a lover of God, like the liberals of today. They tout love, 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 and equality, and all nice words. Right? But you know what's on the inside. You bring a conservative speaker to Berkeley, he has to fear for his life. He has to fear for his life from these lovers of humanity. Right? Bilam puts on a good show, says nice words. And now you can understand that Mishnah and Avos. The Mishnah says, what's the difference between, the Talmidim of Avraham Avinu and the Talmidim of Bilam? And we asked the question, what do you mean what's the difference? You just said that these have an ayin ra as opposed to these who have an ayin tova. These have a ruach gevara as opposed to these have a ruach nemucha. These have a nefesh, nefesh rochava, these have a nefesh shmol. You just said what the difference is. And you have to tell me a chiddush, and because, no, the Talmidei Bilam are going to Gehenna. And the Talmidei Avraham Avinu are going to Gan Eden. The answer is, no, Bilam puts on a good show. Oh, he's, these things, nefesh rochava, ruach nemucha, ayin ra, these are midas. These are all the inner human being. These are the character. But what he does with his arms and legs, and what he says with his mouth, he only says nice things. He puts on a good show. He puts on a really good show. And you might think that since he's putting on a good show, right, that maybe, he acts like a tzaddik, maybe he'll be treated like a tzaddik. And the Mishnah says no, because he's rotten on the inside. Because he's rotten on the inside, he's going to go to Gehenna. Even though he's only rotten on the inside, but on the outside he puts on a good show. We need an admission. Right? We need an admission that all these people are talking about love, humanity, equality, whatever it is, whatever's running right now in the streets. We know that on the inside it's nefesh rochava, it's ruach gavoa, it's ayin ra, and it's all on the inside. It's all a war against Am Yisrael. It's all a war against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? But that's what's on the inside. Right? On the outside, they put on a good show, as if they have nothing against anybody, and they're fighting for equality, and they're fighting for love, and whatnot. Yeah. Right? And that's when you need admission. When things are not on the inside as they are on the outside, you need admission as to what's really going on, what you're really thinking. And that's what the Pia Asum represents. That the as it were, physicality itself speaks up and says what's really going on. And the donkey puts Bilam in his place, saying, "You're going after your titles. You're not serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You never didn't have the right to hit me because you're not better than me. Because you're not serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What makes you better than me that you're allowed to hit me? You're even worse than I am." Right? And that's the admission that the world is waiting for. Right? And if you want to break it down, how this is where we're holding Bisman Hazeh, right? If Shabbos, the end of the seventh millennium, right, comes in, the year 6000, the year 6000 ushers in the seventh millennium. That's Keneged Shabbos, right? So the year 6000, that begins the seventh millennium. That's the big cosmic Shabbos. Where are we right now? Just 200 years away. We're holding Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashos. That's where we are right now. That's on a map of history. We are right now in our time period in the parallel to Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashos. Right? And if it's an interesting thing, in Chumash also, Chazal tells us you can divide up the Chumash into 7 parts. Right, there's Breish Shmos Vayikra, there's Bamidbar before the Parsha Vayibin Soah, and then there's Parshas Vayibin Soah, and then there's Bamidbar after Vayibin Soah, and then there's Parshas Devarim, the Sefer Devarim, which is the 7th. Right now we're at the end of the second part of Sefer Bamidbar, which is the 6th section that you can divide the Chumash into. It's Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashos. And that's and that's why these parshas also come right before the 3 weeks. This is the hardest part. We're trying to bridge Olam Hazeh with the Geula, and that's where there's all the opportunity to fail, all the opportunity to fall out, because it's always hardest before the end. And like we said, we're the one nation that makes the transition, but you could also say we're the one nation that will survive the transition when Olam Hazeh becomes Olam Haba. And that's the corresponding place in Chumash, and that is the corresponding place where we are in history, and the process is not complete until we get a admission from all the forces of creation, particularly the Chamor, particularly the Chomer, particularly the physical. It opens its mouth and admits Hashem Elokei Yisrael Melech U'Malchuso B'Kol Mashal. Okay. That's what I wanted to explain. I don't know if there's any ability for anyone to give me questions, address questions to me. But, okay, I said my piece. All right?
Wow, beautiful. I'm not going to open up a line of questions because it gets crazy, because there's too much background noise, and it's just not what we were trying to start. That was an awesome share. I mean, that is not a typical share. I just want to tell you, wow. There's a lot of information. Really, thank you. A lot of information. This is not ordinary. Maybe we're ordinary, but let me tell you, for most people, this is not ordinary. I really, really appreciate it. And Mr. Steph, I hope we can invite you back. I would love to be here about Purim. I'm sure it's not going to be ordinary either. But thank you so much for taking the time to explain it to us. And